Blood sprayed across sun-scorched adobe walls as iron shackles shattered in the pre-dawn darkness of a Texas cotton plantation, transforming 37 enslaved souls into an army of vengeance in a single explosive heartbeat. Victor Malone, once a prince of the Ashanti kingdom, stood at the center of the chaos with a broken chain wrapped around his fist, his eyes burning with the fury of a man who had lost everything but his will to fight. The overseer's screams echoed across the Rio Grande Valley as makeshift weapons found their targets, painting the dusty ground crimson under a blood-red moon in August 1852. This uprising would become the deadliest slave revolt in American Western history, igniting a manhunt that would span 3 territories and force a young nation to confront the savage contradictions between its frontier mythology of freedom and the brutal reality of human bondage. What began as one man's quest for vengeance would end in a courtroom battle that shook the foundations of Western justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whip cracks split the Texas dawn like a gunshot, but Victor Malone no longer flinched at the sound that had once made him recoil in shame. His hands, calloused and scarred from 18 months of brutal labor, gripped the cotton sack with a steadiness that belied the storm brewing in his chest. The other enslaved workers moved through the rows like ghosts, their backs bent under the merciless August sun that had already begun its ascent over the Copper Valley plantation. But Victor stood different, his posture carrying traces of something the overseers had tried desperately to beat out of him, the bearing of royalty that no amount of suffering could fully erase. Wesley Ford paced between the rows with his leather whip coiled at his side, his boots kicking up red dust that settled on the cotton plants like dried blood. He was a cruel man who took particular pleasure in breaking spirits, and Victor Malone had become his obsession. There was something in the tall African's eyes that Ford couldn't crush, a defiance that burned quietly behind a mask of obedience. It infuriated him that this man, who had arrived in chains speaking no English, now understood every insult, every threat, every promise of violence, yet refused to show the proper fear. The plantation belonged to Aaron Jennings, a former Tennessee tobacco farmer who had moved west seeking fortune in Texas cotton. His estate sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime bottomland along the Brazos River, worked by 42 enslaved people who had been purchased, traded, or inherited from failed ventures across the South. Jennings rarely involved himself in the day-to-day brutality required to maintain his operation, preferring to delegate such unpleasantness to men like Ford, while he entertained guests with stories of frontier adventure and agricultural innovation. Victor had been Prince Kofi of the Ashanti kingdom when Portuguese raiders attacked his village during a diplomatic journey to coastal trading posts. His father, the regional chief, had sent him to negotiate treaties with European merchants, believing that understanding their ways would protect his people from exploitation. Instead, the young prince found himself ambushed on a jungle path, drugged with opium-laced water, and transported in chains to a slave fortress on the Gold Coast. The irony was not lost on him that his attempt to engage peacefully with the foreign traders had delivered him directly into their most profitable enterprise. The Middle Passage had stripped away his royal garments and privileges, but not his memory or his mind. Victor remembered every detail of his former life. The weight of ceremonial gold around his neck, the respect in his subjects' eyes, the complex political discussions he had mediated between rival clans. He remembered his mother's songs, his father's wisdom about leadership requiring both strength and compassion, and the younger sister he had promised to return to, with stories of the strange pale men from across the water. Those memories sustained him through horrors that broke other men's sanity. Emily Johnson worked the row adjacent to Victor, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the pain that radiated from her shoulders. She had been born into slavery on a Mississippi plantation, sold west when her first owner died bankrupt. Unlike Victor, she had never known freedom, but his quiet stories about life before chains had awakened something in her that felt dangerous and thrilling. He spoke of it carefully, in whispered fragments during the brief moments when Ford's attention wandered, painting pictures of a world where people like them made decisions about their own lives. Mia Davis and Evelyn Thomas, 2 women who had survived the auction blocks in New Orleans before being transported to Texas, had also fallen under Victor's subtle influence. He never spoke of rebellion directly, understanding that loose words could mean death, but his very existence challenged the lie they had been taught since birth, that their enslavement was natural, ordained, inevitable. A prince reduced to picking cotton proved that slavery was not about inherent inferiority, but about power and violence, a lesson that could not be unlearned once understood. The previous night, Victor had gathered 7 trusted souls in the darkness behind the cotton gin, speaking in low tones that barely rose above the crickets' chorus. Jordan Pierce, a blacksmith whose skills made him valuable enough to move somewhat freely between the forge and fields, had been working on a plan for weeks. The plantation's isolation, 30 miles from the nearest town of Dust Creek, meant that help would take hours to arrive if they chose their moment carefully. The monthly supply wagon was due in 3 days, which meant the plantation would be stocked with provisions they could seize for a journey south toward Mexico, where slavery had been abolished 20 years earlier. Victor's leadership had emerged naturally, not through force but through the quiet authority that came from actually knowing how to organize people toward a common goal. In his father's court, he had learned that successful action required careful planning, understanding of resources, and the ability to inspire others without coercion. These skills, refined through royal training, now served a purpose his tutors never could have imagined: planning the violent overthrow of his captors. Ford's whip suddenly cracked near Victor's head, close enough that he felt the displaced air against his cheek. The overseer grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth, waiting for the flinch that never came. This daily testing had become a ritual between them, Ford searching for the breaking point while Victor maintained his steady gaze just long enough to show spirit, then lowering his eyes before the moment became an executable offense. It was a careful dance on the edge of violence, each man knowing that one miscalculation could end in blood. The sun climbed higher, turning the cotton fields into a furnace that baked the moisture from bodies already pushed beyond healthy limits. 3 workers had died during the previous summer from heat and exhaustion, their bodies buried in unmarked graves beyond the property line. Jennings had been irritated by the financial loss, but not moved to improve conditions. Enslaved people were replaceable, he often said, though good field hands were becoming more expensive, as the legal international slave trade had ended decades earlier. Victor's mind worked through the details of what would happen in 3 nights. Time. The supply wagon would arrive at dusk, its driver and guard would be fed and housed in the overseer's quarters, and the plantation's meager security would be focused on protecting valuable goods, rather than watching enslaved people who had no apparent means of escape. That would be their moment, when complacency created opportunity, when the long-planned uprising would transform from whispered hope into explosive reality. But even as he planned, Victor understood the mathematics of their situation. 37 enslaved people against armed overseers and the might of the Texas Rangers who would inevitably pursue them meant that success required more than courage. They would need speed, surprise, and ruthlessness, along with a willingness to do things that would haunt them forever if they survived. Revolution was not clean or noble in execution, regardless of how just the cause. Blood would flow, and not all of it would belong to their oppressors. Emily caught his eye across the cotton rows, a question in her glance that Victor answered with the slightest nod. 3 more days of submission, 3 more days of pretending the chains had won, and then they would either die free or live to see Mexico's mountains rising in the distance. The choice between those outcomes would be decided by violence, planning, and the willingness to risk everything for a chance at what Victor had once possessed, and what Emily had never known: the simple dignity of determining one's own fate. Nekas. Victor's journey from Prince Kofi to enslaved cotton picker had taken 14 months, each stage stripping away another layer of his former identity, while paradoxically strengthening his core sense of self. The Ashanti kingdom he had left behind was a sophisticated society with complex governance structures, extensive trade networks, and military capabilities that had resisted European colonization attempts for generations. His education had included diplomacy, military strategy, agricultural management, and the intricate social protocols that maintained harmony among diverse tribal affiliations. None of that training had prepared him for betrayal by the very merchants his father had sent him to befriend. The slave fortress at Cape Coast Castle had been his first encounter with industrial-scale human trafficking, hundreds of captives packed into underground dungeons, the stone walls slick with moisture and waste, the air so thick with suffering that breathing felt like swallowing poison. Victor had spent 6 weeks in those conditions, watching people succumb to disease and despair while European and African traders negotiated prices in the courtyard above. He learned then that slavery was a collaborative enterprise, requiring not just European demand but African cooperation from rival kingdoms and opportunistic raiders willing to sell their neighbors for guns and manufactured goods. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ship that carried him across the Atlantic was named the Prosperity, a bitter irony not lost on the 200 souls chained in its hold. Victor had been packed so tightly against other bodies that lying down was impossible, forcing everyone to sleep sitting or crouching in positions that turned muscles into agony. The voyage lasted 7 weeks, during which 43 people died from disease, dehydration, or the simple loss of will to continue existing in such conditions. Their bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony, disappearing into waters that had swallowed millions of similar victims over centuries of this obscene traffic. Landing in New Orleans had brought Victor face to face with American slavery's unique characteristics. Unlike the Roman slavery he had studied in histories, or even the domestic servitude practiced in some African societies, this system was racial, hereditary, and absolute. One drop of African blood legally transformed a person into property that could be bought, sold, bred, or destroyed, at an owner's discretion. The auction block where Victor stood, naked and examined like livestock, was designed to humiliate as much as evaluate, breaking spirits before the actual labor began. Aaron Jennings had purchased Victor for $1,200, a premium price that reflected his youth, apparent health, and impressive physical stature. The slave trader had described him as a prime buck, straight from Africa, unbroken but trainable, language that reduced human complexity to animal husbandry terms. Jennings had been expanding his Texas operations and needed strong workers who could handle the brutal labor of clearing new fields and maintaining existing cotton rows through seasons that stretched from March, planting through November harvest. The journey from New Orleans to Copper Valley took 3 weeks by wagon, Victor chained alongside 5 other recent purchases. They traveled through territories that had been Mexican land just 6 years earlier, before the war that transformed Texas and the Southwest into American possessions. The landscape changed from bayou to prairie to the semi-arid bottomlands along the Brazos River, where cotton grew in soil that seemed to drink water and return fiber worth more than gold per acre when markets were favorable. Wesley Ford had been given responsibility for breaking Victor within the first week of his arrival. The overseer's methods were sophisticated in their cruelty, alternating between violence and psychological manipulation, seeking the particular weakness that would transform resistance into submission. He discovered quickly that physical pain alone would not work on this African, who seemed capable of absorbing beatings with disturbing stoicism. But isolation, sleep deprivation, and forced witnessing of other workers' suffering proved more effective at creating the appearance of compliance. The appearance was all Victor needed to provide. Beneath the mask of obedience, he observed everything with the trained eye of someone educated in strategy and organization. He noted the plantation's layout, identified its vulnerabilities, cataloged the weapons kept in the main house and overseer's quarters, and memorized the schedules that governed when guards were alert versus careless. He learned English with remarkable speed, understanding that language was power in this new world, though he was careful to hide the full extent of his comprehension. Emily Johnson became his first ally, not through any romantic connection but through mutual recognition of complementary strengths. She understood the plantation's internal dynamics after 3 years of survival, knowing which overseers were truly dangerous versus merely performatively cruel, which enslaved workers could be trusted versus which might trade information for better treatment. Her knowledge of the social landscape complemented Victor's strategic thinking, creating a partnership built on pragmatic necessity rather than sentiment. Jordan Pierce added practical skills that would prove essential for any escape attempt. His position as the plantation's blacksmith gave him access to tools, metal, and the ability to move between different work areas without constant supervision. More importantly, he knew how to repair and maintain the chains, shackles, and iron implements that literally held the slavery system together, knowledge that could be reverse-engineered into knowing how to break them. His forge also provided legitimate excuse for fires and metalworking sounds that could mask preparation activities. Mia Davis and Evelyn Thomas brought different but equally valuable assets. Mia worked in the main house, which meant she overheard conversations between Jennings and his visitors, gathering intelligence about wider political developments, market conditions, and law enforcement activities in surrounding territories. Evelyn managed the plantation's vegetable gardens, giving her knowledge of which plants were edible, medicinal, or poisonous, information that could mean survival during a desperate flight toward Mexican territory. Together, these five formed the core of what would become a 37-person conspiracy. They recruited carefully, targeting individuals who showed signs of inner strength rather than mere anger. Rage was easy to find on a plantation, but sustained resistance required discipline, patience, and the ability to delay gratification of vengeance until the moment when it could actually succeed. Victor understood that a premature or poorly executed revolt would end with all of them hanging from ropes, their deaths serving as warnings rather than inspiration. The planning consumed 4 months of careful preparation. They stockpiled food stolen in quantities small enough to avoid detection, one biscuit or piece of dried meat at a time, accumulating into supplies that could sustain travel. They crafted weapons from agricultural tools, learning to hide modified hoes and sharpened cotton hooks in locations that appeared innocuous but could be accessed quickly. They rehearsed and whispered conversations and subtle gestures, building coordination without ever gathering in groups large enough to attract suspicion. Victor drew on his royal education to structure their organization. He divided responsibilities among trusted lieutenants, created backup plans for likely complications, and established communication signals that could convey complex information through simple gestures visible across work areas. His father had taught him that successful campaigns required logistics as much as courage, that amateur warriors focused on the battle while professional soldiers focused on supply lines, information flows, and contingency planning. The Mexico option had emerged through conversations with Jordan Pierce, who had once worked alongside a freedman from Louisiana who had successfully fled south. The border was roughly 200 miles away, a journey that would take weeks on foot through hostile territory where slave catchers operated with legal impunity. But Mexican law prohibited slavery absolutely, meaning that anyone who reached the Rio Grande's southern bank would be legally free, protected by a government that had no incentive to cooperate with American authorities seeking runaway property. Yet Victor knew that simply fleeing would not satisfy the rage burning in many hearts around him. These were people who had suffered beatings, rape, family separations, and systematic dehumanization. They wanted more than escape. They wanted justice, or at least revenge, before disappearing into Mexican territory. That desire for violent retribution, complicated planning, adding risk factors that made practical success less likely, but psychological satisfaction more necessary. Victor had to balance strategic prudence against emotional needs that were entirely legitimate given the circumstances. As August heat reached its peak and the supply wagon's arrival approached, Victor spent his nights reviewing every detail of their plan. 3 days remained before the moment when chains would shatter, blood would flow, and 37 people would gamble everything on a desperate bid for freedom that would either end in triumph or tragedy. The supply wagon arrived exactly on schedule, its wheels kicking up dust clouds visible from miles away across the flat bottomland. Victor watched from the cotton fields as the driver and his armed guard climbed down from the bench seat, stretching muscles cramped from the 30-mile journey from Dust Creek. Wesley Ford emerged from the overseer's quarters to supervise the unloading, his whip hanging casually from his belt, his attention focused on inventorying barrels of flour, salt pork, and the whiskey that Aaron Jennings favored for entertaining guests. The timing was perfect. Jennings had departed 2 days earlier for San Antonio, leaving Ford in charge with only 2 other overseers to maintain order across 3,000 acres and 42 enslaved workers. The plantation's isolation, normally a disadvantage for those seeking escape, now worked in their favor by ensuring that screams would not carry to neighboring properties or attract immediate intervention. Victor felt his pulse steady rather than accelerate as the moment approached, his royal training asserting itself in the form of calm focus that came from accepting that outcomes were now beyond his control. Emily moved through her assigned tasks in the main house, preparing the evening meal that would be served to Ford and the wagon crew. Her hands worked mechanically, slicing vegetables and stirring pots while her mind raced through final preparations. The laudanum she had stolen from Jennings' medicine cabinet over the previous month, tiny amounts that would never be missed, now sat measured and ready in her apron pocket. Mixed into the whiskey that the men would certainly consume, it would not kill them, but would slow their reflexes and cloud their judgment at the critical moment when seconds would determine who lived and who died. Jordan Pierce worked his forge with unusual intensity that afternoon, the hammer strikes ringing across the plantation with rhythmic precision. To any casual observer, he was simply completing repair work on plow blades damaged during the previous week's field preparation. But hidden among the legitimate metalwork were items he had crafted specifically for this night. Crude but functional blades, fashioned from barrel hoops, sharpened stakes made from scrap iron, and metal tools that could serve as clubs or prying instruments when wielded with sufficient force. Mia Davis folded laundry in the main house, her movements slow and methodical as she positioned herself to observe Ford's quarters through the window. She tracked the overseer's routine with the attention of someone whose life depended on accurate intelligence, noting when he checked his pistol, how much whiskey he poured, and whether he seemed unusually alert or merely going through his standard evening pattern. Everything appeared normal, which meant their opportunity remained intact. Evelyn Thomas distributed the evening rations to enslaved workers gathering near the quarters, handing out cornmeal and salt pork while making eye contact with each member of their conspiracy. No words were exchanged, but the slight nod she received in return confirmed that everyone understood their assignments. 37 people had somehow maintained absolute secrecy for months, a testament to both their discipline and their desperation. Tonight would reveal whether that secrecy could transform into successful action. The sun set in shades of orange and purple that painted the Texas sky like a watercolor prophecy. Victor watched it descend while his hands continued their assigned labor, picking cotton with mechanical efficiency, while his mind walked through every step of what would happen once darkness fell completely. He thought briefly of his father, wondering what the Ashanti chief would think of his son, leading a slave revolt in a foreign land. Would he see it as honorable resistance or tragic waste? Victor pushed the question aside, knowing that surviving the next few hours mattered more than philosophical contemplation. Ford and the wagon crew settled into their evening routine, eating the meal Emily prepared, and drinking the whiskey she poured with careful attention to ensure each glass received its measured dose of laudanum. The men's laughter grew louder as alcohol worked its magic, their conversation turning to crude jokes and boasts about women they had known or claimed to have conquered. None of them noticed Emily's hands trembling slightly as she refilled their glasses, or the way she positioned herself near the door for quick exit when the moment arrived. By 10 o'clock, the plantation had settled into its normal nocturnal rhythm. Enslaved workers lay in their quarters, seemingly exhausted from another day of brutal labor. The main house sat dark except for lamplight in Ford's room, where the overseer and his guests continued drinking. 2 guards made lazy circuits around the property perimeter, their attention focused inward toward the enslaved quarters, rather than outward toward external threats they had no reason to expect. Victor rose from his pallet at precisely 11 o'clock, moving through the darkness with practiced silence. Others followed, 36 shadows emerging from quarters where they had pretended to sleep. No one spoke. They had rehearsed this choreography so many times in whispered planning sessions that words were unnecessary. Each person knew their target, their weapon, their assignment in the carefully orchestrated violence that was about to unfold. Jordan Pierce reached the tool shed first, distributing the weapons he had hidden among legitimate agricultural implements. Sharpened hoes, modified cotton hooks, iron stakes, and crude blades passed from hand to hand. The weight of these makeshift weapons felt substantial, transforming agricultural tools into instruments of revolution. Victor gripped a machete-like blade that Jordan had fashioned from a broken plowshare, its edge honed to razor sharpness through patient work at the forge. The first guard died without understanding what killed him. Parker Grant, a quiet man who had lost his wife to a fever the previous winter, struck from behind with an iron stake that crushed the guard's skull before he could cry out. The body crumpled silently, dragged into shadows where it would not be immediately discovered. 1 down, 1 guard remaining, plus Ford and the 2 wagon crew members who were hopefully impaired by laudanum but still dangerous. The second guard proved more alert, turning at some slight sound that betrayed the approaching group. His mouth opened to shout warning, but Damian Fuller was faster, closing the distance with desperate speed and driving a sharpened hoe blade into the man's throat. Blood sprayed across cotton plants, black in the moonlight, as the guard clutched at his ruined neck and fell backward. The sound of his body hitting the ground seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, causing everyone to freeze and wait for responding alarm. None came. The plantation remained still, except for their own harsh breathing. Victor led the main group toward Ford's quarters, where lamplight still showed through windows and voices indicated the men remained awake, despite the late hour and the laudanum that should have been pulling them toward sleep. Emily had warned that the overseer had a remarkable tolerance for alcohol, built through years of steady consumption, which might have metabolized the drug faster than expected. They could not wait any longer, risking discovery at dawn, so they would proceed regardless of whether their chemical advantage remained intact. The door to Ford's quarters burst inward with explosive force, as Victor and 5 others rushed through, weapons raised. Ford scrambled for his pistol, his reflexes indeed slower than normal but not completely eliminated. He managed to grab the weapon and raise it toward the intruders, his face showing sudden comprehension of what was happening. But Simon Briggs, wielding a modified cotton hook, was faster, striking Ford's arm and sending the pistol clattering across the floor. What followed was chaos compressed into seconds that felt like hours. The wagon driver tried to reach for a rifle mounted on the wall, but Tristan Boyd tackled him, both men crashing into furniture that splintered under their combined weight. The armed guard fought back with surprising effectiveness despite the laudanum, landing blows that sent 2 attackers reeling before Cooper Ellis struck him across the back of the head with an iron bar. Ford proved as difficult to kill as he had been to break during months of tormenting enslaved workers. Even injured and outnumbered, he fought with desperate savagery, understanding that surrender meant certain death. He kicked, bit, punched, and clawed like a cornered animal, his survival instinct overriding any rational calculation of odds. It took 4 people to finally subdue him, their combined weight pinning him to the floor while Victor approached with the blade that Jordan had crafted. The moment stretched into eternity as Victor stood over the overseer who had beaten him, humiliated him, and tried repeatedly to break his spirit. Ford's eyes showed terror mixed with defiance, understanding that mercy was not forthcoming. Victor thought of his sister, his mother, his father, and the life that had been stolen from him through betrayal and violence. He thought of Emily's scars, Jordan's missing fingers from a punishment beating, Evelyn's dead son sold away before she could even name him. The blade fell. Blood sprayed across walls that had witnessed so much suffering. Ford's body jerked once, twice, then lay still. Victor stepped back, looking at his hands covered in gore, and felt no triumph, only exhausted recognition that some barriers, once crossed, could never be recrossed. The wagon crew members died more quickly, their laudanum-impaired reactions making them easy targets for people who had nothing left to lose. Within 15 minutes of entering Ford's quarters, all 3 men lay dead, their blood soaking into floorboards that would carry the stain for decades after the building itself had rotted away. Victor emerged into the night air, his breathing heavy, his mind already racing ahead to next steps. They had perhaps 6 hours before anyone from Dust Creek might notice something wrong, maybe 12 hours before organized pursuit began. That head start would have to suffice for a 200-mile journey through territory where their faces marked them as fugitive property, where every white person they encountered represented potential capture or death. Emily appeared at his side, her face pale but composed. The main house is secured. We found weapons, money, and supplies. The other overseers are dead. Her voice carried no emotion, just factual reporting of completed tasks. She had killed 2, Victor realized, crossing the same barrier that now separated them from their former selves. 37 people gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the bodies of their former captors. They had done the impossible, seizing control of the plantation through violence that would be called murder by the law, but felt like justice to those who had survived years of systematic brutality. Now came the harder part, transforming that momentary victory into lasting freedom. Dawn arrived with surreal normalcy, the sun rising over fields where cotton still needed picking and blood still stained the ground. Victor stood at the center of what had been the plantation's main yard, now transformed into a staging area for the most desperate journey any of them would ever attempt. 37 people looked to him for direction, their faces showing a mixture of exhilaration, terror, and the glazed expression of those who had crossed moral lines they never imagined crossing. The immediate challenge was logistics. They had weapons now, proper firearms taken from the main house and Ford's quarters, along with ammunition, food supplies, and 2 horses that could carry provisions or injured people. But 37 people moving together would be impossible to hide, leaving tracks and attracting attention across 200 miles of territory where their appearance alone would mark them as fugitives. They needed to split into smaller groups, taking different routes toward Mexico, while maintaining enough connection to provide mutual support if pursued. Emily organized the distribution of supplies with clinical efficiency, dividing food into equal portions that would sustain people for roughly 2 weeks if strictly rationed. She worked alongside Mia and Evelyn, the 3 women demonstrating the same coordination they had shown during months of planning. Dried meat, hardtack, cornmeal, and several sacks of dried beans were packed into improvised carry bags fashioned from cotton sacks. Water presented a bigger challenge, since canteens were scarce and the August heat would demand constant hydration. Jordan Pierce worked on a different problem: destroying evidence that might aid pursuit. He set fires in the main house, Ford's quarters, and the cotton gin, watching flames consume structures that had represented years of suffering. The goal was not mere destruction but confusion, buying time by making it difficult for investigators to determine exactly what had happened, how many people had been involved, or which direction they had fled. Smoke rose into the morning sky, visible for miles but hopefully attributed to accident rather than revolt, until enough time had passed to establish a decent head start. Victor gathered the group for what would be their last collective moment before dispersing into smaller units. He spoke in the mixture of English and fragmented African dialects that had become their common language, his voice carrying the authority that 4 months of planning and 1 night of successful violence had earned him. "We have maybe half a day before riders come from Dust Creek. By sunset tomorrow, every lawman and slave catcher between here and the Rio Grande will be hunting us. We cannot stay together." We split into 6 groups, each taking different routes south. The division of groups had been planned weeks earlier, based on family connections, physical capabilities, and geographic knowledge. Married couples stayed together where possible, though Victor insisted that anyone slowing their group through injury or exhaustion would be left behind. That brutal calculation drew angry protests from some who believed their new freedom should include compassion for the weak, but Victor remained firm, explaining that sentiment would get everyone killed, while hard pragmatism might allow some to survive. His own group would include Emily, Jordan, Mia, and 4 others chosen for their physical endurance and strategic value. They would take the most direct route south, moving quickly through relatively open country, where their speed might compensate for higher visibility. Other groups would take more circuitous paths through rougher terrain, trading directness for concealment. Before they separated, Victor addressed the question that hung unspoken over everyone: what if they were caught? Texas law was unambiguous about slave revolt. Execution was mandatory for anyone involved in killing white people during an escape attempt, but death by hanging was relatively quick compared to other punishments that angry plantation owners and outraged communities might devise. Some advocated for suicide pacts, quick deaths by their own hands rather than surrendering to brutal executions designed for public spectacle. Victor refused to make that decision for others, telling each person to follow their own conscience if capture became inevitable. The firearms presented both opportunity and danger. Having weapons meant they could defend themselves if cornered, but using them would guarantee the most severe retaliation possible. Victor established strict rules. Guns were for absolute last resort only, to be fired only if capture and certain death were the alternative. The noise would bring every armed man within miles, transforming their escape into a military-style manhunt that would end badly, regardless of how many pursuers they killed. As the groups began dispersing, heading in different directions like seeds scattered by wind, Victor allowed himself a moment to observe the landscape that had been his prison for 18 months. The cotton fields stretched toward the horizon, white bowls ready for harvesting that would never happen. The burned structures still smoldered, sending smoke signals announcing that something unprecedented had occurred at Aaron Jennings's Copper Valley plantation. Bodies lay where they had fallen, attracting flies in the growing heat. This place would become famous, Victor realized. A cautionary tale used to justify increased brutality toward enslaved people across the South. But before you hear what happened next, during their desperate flight toward freedom, I need to know something. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below letting me know, because this story is about to get even more intense. And if you are fascinated by true stories of people fighting impossible odds for freedom, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What happens next will shock you, because Victor Malone's revolt was just beginning, and the bloodiest chapter was still ahead. The last group disappeared into the tree line at roughly 9 in the morning, leaving the plantation eerily quiet except for crackling flames and the nervous sounds of abandoned livestock. Victor's group waited an additional hour, allowing others to create distance before beginning their own journey. They moved south initially, following the Brazos River's course toward the point where it bent westward, where they would abandon the water route in favor of overland travel through more defenseless terrain. Emily walked beside Victor, her face set in grim determination. She had killed one of the wagon crew members during the revolt, driving a kitchen knife into his chest with force that surprised even her. That act had severed her last connection to any fantasy that they could escape without becoming the violent criminals that Southern law would label them. She was a murderer now by legal definition, though the man she killed had participated in a system that murdered souls, if not always bodies. The moral ambiguity would haunt her, but first they had to survive long enough for guilt to matter. Jordan Pierce brought up the rear of their group, constantly scanning behind them for signs of pursuit that would inevitably come. His blacksmith's hands gripped a rifle taken from Jennings' gun cabinet, his finger resting near but not on the trigger. He had loaded the weapon but engaged the safety mechanism, understanding that an accidental discharge would be catastrophic. Like the others, he carried the weight of what they had done. The knowledge that 7 men had died by their hands in a single night of coordinated violence. The August heat climbed toward its midday peak as they covered the first 5 miles, moving at a pace that balanced speed against exhaustion. They saw no one, which was both reassuring and ominous. The plantation's isolation meant they were unlikely to encounter casual travelers. But it also meant that when pursuit finally came, it would be organized and relentless. Texas Rangers, professional slave catchers, and armed posses of angry property owners would converge on their last known location with a determination that made capture almost inevitable for most fugitives. But Victor had one advantage that typical runaways lacked: military education from his royal upbringing. He understood pursuit patterns, supply line requirements, and the psychological factors that caused hunters to make predictable choices. He planned to exploit that knowledge ruthlessly, leading them along routes that would frustrate trackers, setting false trails, and moving in patterns that defied the assumptions that slave catchers relied upon. It might not be enough, but it was more than most fugitives possessed. By noon, they had covered 10 miles, putting useful distance between themselves and the plantation. They rested briefly near a small creek, refilling water containers and eating small amounts of dried meat. No one spoke much, each person lost in private thoughts about what they had left behind and what uncertain future lay ahead. Some would die during this journey, Victor knew. Age, injury, or simple bad luck would claim lives that had survived so much already. But some would make it, would cross the Rio Grande and find freedom in Mexican territory. That possibility justified everything, even the blood on their hands, even the knowledge that their actions would be used to justify increased oppression of those who remained enslaved. The afternoon stretched ahead as they resumed their march south, leaving the Brazos River behind and heading into more open country, where concealment would become increasingly difficult. Behind them, smoke from the burning plantation was surely visible in Dust Creek by now, drawing attention and questions that would soon transform into organized manhunt. The race had begun, and the finish line lay 200 miles away across some of the most unforgiving territory in Texas. The first 3 days of flight passed in a blur of constant movement and gnawing fear. Victor's group covered roughly 60 miles, pushing their bodies beyond normal endurance while rationing water and food with mathematical precision. The landscape shifted from river bottomland to rolling prairie, offering less cover but faster travel across terrain that left fewer tracks than muddy riverbanks. They moved primarily at night, hiding during daylight hours in whatever natural depressions or sparse tree clusters they could find. On the fourth morning, they encountered their first serious obstacle. A wide creek that should have been easily fordable after the dry summer had swollen from unexpected rainfall upstream, its waters rushing brown and turbulent between steep banks. Swimming was possible but dangerous, especially for those carrying supplies and weapons. Worse, the delay required to scout for safer crossing points cost them precious hours that allowed pursuit to narrow the distance between hunter and hunted. Emily nearly drowned during the crossing, swept downstream when her foot caught between submerged rocks. Jordan Pierce dove after her, his blacksmith's strength allowing him to fight the current and drag her to the opposite bank. They lost 1 rifle in 2 days, worth of food in the incident, reducing their already marginal supplies. The setback forced a brutal discussion about whether continuing as a group made strategic sense, or whether they should fragment further into smaller units that could move faster and sustain themselves on less. Victor decided they would stay together, reasoning that their combined skills and firepower offered better defense against inevitable confrontation than splitting would provide. But the decision weighed heavily because it meant slower progress and higher visibility. Every choice carried life-or-death consequences, and second-guessing came naturally when exhaustion and fear clouded judgment. By the 6th day, they began seeing signs of organized pursuit. Distant dust clouds suggesting mounted riders. Abandoned campsites still warm from recent occupation, and most ominously the sound of baying hounds carried on the wind. Slave catchers used dogs specifically trained to track human scent, animals that could follow trails days old across terrain that confused human trackers. The sound of those dogs sent primitive terror through everyone who heard it, awakening ancestral memories of being hunted prey. Mia Davis, who had been holding up remarkably well despite being the oldest member of their group at 43, collapsed on the 7th day. Heat exhaustion combined with an infected blister on her foot had poisoned her blood, causing fever that made continued travel impossible. The group faced their first true moral crisis: stay with her and risk everyone's capture, or leave her behind to die slowly from infection and exposure. Victor made the decision that leadership required, though it hollowed something inside him. They would leave Mia with water, food, and one of their remaining pistols. If she recovered enough to travel, she could attempt to follow their trail. If not, she could choose her own end rather than face capture. Emily argued passionately against abandoning her, but Victor remained adamant that sentiment could not override survival. 7 people might reach Mexico. 8 would certainly fail. They left Mia under a rock overhang that offered shade and concealment, her fevered eyes following them with understanding rather than accusation. She knew the mathematics as well as anyone, had agreed to this possibility during their original planning. Emily wept as they walked away, the first tears any of them had shed since the revolt. Grief was a luxury they could barely afford, but humanity demanded some acknowledgement of the cost they were paying for freedom. The terrain grew increasingly hostile as they pushed further south. Water sources became scarce, forcing them to travel longer distances between refilling opportunities. The August sun beat down with relentless intensity, turning the landscape into a furnace that drained moisture from their bodies faster than they could replace it. 2 members of their group developed severe sunburn, their skin blistering and peeling in sheets that left raw flesh exposed to further damage. On the 10th day, they spotted their first real danger, a settlement of perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a crossroads. Avoiding it meant adding 15 miles to their journey through even more exposed terrain. Going through it or near it risked recognition, since news of the Copper Valley Revolt would have spread across Texas by now, with descriptions of the fugitives posted in every town and trading post. Victor scouted the settlement alone during the night, moving with the stealth he had learned during hunting expeditions in his African homeland. He discovered that the town maintained a small jail, housed a Texas Ranger outpost, and was filled with armed men who looked like exactly the kind of professional slave catchers who would be seeking large rewards. They would have to go around, accepting the additional distance as necessary cost of staying alive. The detour consumed 2 more days and most of their remaining food. They were now 13 days into a journey that should take roughly 25 days total, but their pace had slowed dramatically, as exhaustion and malnutrition took their toll. Jordan Pierce suggested they might need to risk approaching an isolated ranch to steal food and horses, but Victor rejected the idea as too dangerous. Any contact with the white population would likely result in immediate alarm and pursuit. Instead, they began supplementing their diet with whatever they could forage: roots dug from the hard ground, insects captured under rocks, and, on one fortunate occasion, a rattlesnake that Jordan killed and they roasted over a carefully contained fire. The meat was tough and gamey but represented protein their bodies desperately needed. They ate every scrap, sucking marrow from bones and chewing the skin until nothing remained. By the 15th day, Victor could see the toll their journey was taking. Everyone had lost significant weight, their clothes hanging loose on frames that had been muscular just 2 weeks earlier. Infected wounds, persistent dehydration, and the constant psychological stress of being hunted were breaking down their bodies and spirits. They still had roughly 85 miles to cover before reaching the Rio Grande, and Victor honestly questioned whether half of them would survive to see Mexican territory. The sound of dogs grew louder on the 16th day, no longer distant threats but immediate danger closing in from the northeast. Their pursuers had finally caught the scent trail and were following with the relentless patience of professionals who knew that exhausted fugitives could only run so far before their bodies simply gave out. Captain Derek Vaughn of the Texas Rangers received word of the Copper Valley Massacre on August 19th, 3 days after the revolt. The messenger who rode into his San Antonio headquarters was dusty and exhausted, carrying news that would transform what might have been a local manhunt into a territory-wide emergency. 7 white men murdered, 37 enslaved people on the run, and property damage exceeding $15,000 made this the most significant slave revolt in Texas history. Vaughn assembled his response with military precision. He commanded 18 rangers, professional lawmen who specialized in tracking fugitives across brutal terrain. To these he added 23 volunteers from local ranches and towns, men motivated by a mixture of genuine law enforcement interest, racial ideology, and the substantial rewards that Aaron Jennings was offering for return of his property. $5,000 for the capture of the revolt's leaders, $1,000 for each additional fugitive returned alive. The hunting party departed San Antonio on August 21st, riding hard toward Copper Valley with pack animals carrying supplies for an extended pursuit. Vaughn had fought Comanche raiders, tracked murderers through hundreds of miles of wilderness, and developed a reputation for never abandoning a chase until his quarry was captured or confirmed dead. He viewed the slave revolt not as a moral question, but as a professional challenge, a puzzle to be solved through superior tracking skills and relentless determination. Aaron Jennings himself joined the pursuit, his rage over the destruction of his property overriding any concerns about personal safety. He rode alongside Vaughn, offering detailed descriptions of the enslaved workers who had fled, identifying Victor Malone as the likely ringleader based on Ford's reports about the Africans' persistent defiance. Jennings wanted Victor taken alive if possible, believing that a public execution would serve as powerful deterrent against future revolts. The hunting party reached the burned ruins of Copper Valley on August 23rd, finding bodies that had begun decomposing in the summer heat. Vultures scattered as the rangers approached, leaving behind partially consumed corpses that made identification difficult. Vaughn walked through the carnage with clinical detachment, reconstructing the revolt's sequence through careful observation of wound patterns, blood distribution, and the positioning of bodies. His conclusion was troubling. This had not been a spontaneous explosion of rage but a carefully planned military operation. The coordinated timing, the targeting of specific individuals, and the systematic destruction of evidence all pointed to sophisticated leadership that was unusual among enslaved populations. Whoever had organized this revolt possessed strategic thinking that would make them far more dangerous than typical runaways. The tracking began immediately, with Vaughn's most experienced rangers fanning out to locate trails leading away from the plantation. They quickly identified multiple paths heading in different directions, confirming that the fugitives had split into smaller groups as any competent leader would order. Vaughn made a calculated decision to focus resources on the largest and freshest trail, heading south-southwest toward Mexican territory. If they could capture that group's leader, the others would be easier to round up afterward. The Rangers made excellent time initially, their horses and superior knowledge of terrain allowing them to cover ground much faster than people traveling on foot while carrying limited supplies. But on the 4th day of pursuit, they encountered the swollen creek that had delayed Victor's group, losing precious hours finding a ford suitable for horses and pack animals. Vaughn cursed the weather that had aided the fugitives through sheer random chance. They discovered Mia Davis on the 7th day of their hunt, still alive but barely conscious in her rock shelter. A ranger sergeant checked her pulse and shook his head, indicating she would not survive more than another day without medical attention they could not provide. Vaughn questioned her about the other fugitives, direction and strength, but fever had stolen her ability to communicate coherently. He ordered one of his men to shoot her as an act of mercy rather than leaving her to die slowly, the gunshot echoing across empty prairie like a grim announcement of their approach. The discovery confirmed that Vaughn was on the right trail and that the fugitives were suffering significant attrition. He pushed his men harder, sensing that their quarry was weakening and that capture was becoming more likely with each passing day. The Rangers traveled 18 hours daily, resting only during the darkest night hours when tracking became impossible. Meanwhile, another complication emerged from an unexpected direction. Mexican authorities along the Rio Grande had received word about the revolt and were preparing their response to fugitives who might successfully cross the border. Governor Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, eager to avoid diplomatic incidents with Texas, issued orders that any armed fugitives approaching Mexican territory should be intercepted and held for negotiation with American authorities. This policy shift represented a betrayal of Mexico's traditionally liberal stance on escaped enslaved people. Santa Anna calculated that maintaining good relations with Texas mattered more than abstract principles about human freedom, especially given ongoing tensions over border definitions and water rights. His orders placed Mexican troops at likely crossing points, creating a potential trap where fugitives fleeing American pursuit would run directly into Mexican detention. Word of this policy change spread slowly through informal networks, but it had not yet reached Victor's group, who continued believing that Mexico represented guaranteed sanctuary. They pushed toward the border with faith that crossing the Rio Grande would deliver them to freedom, unaware that betrayal might await them on both sides of the river. Back in Dust Creek and other Texas towns, public reaction to the revolt intensified daily. Newspapers published lurid accounts of the massacre, often exaggerating the violence and inventing details that portrayed the fugitives as savage monsters rather than desperate people fighting for freedom. Southern politicians used the incident to argue for stricter slave codes and more aggressive pursuit policies, warning that leniency would encourage similar revolts across the region. Northern abolitionists received news of the revolt with mixed emotions. Some celebrated Victor's courage, while others worried that violent resistance would undermine their moral arguments against slavery. Frederick Douglass had not yet written about the case, though reports suggest he was following developments closely and considering whether the Copper Valley Revolt represented justified self-defense or counterproductive violence. The web of pursuit, politics, and moral complexity tightened around Victor's shrinking group as they struggled through their third week of flight, still unaware that capture might come from unexpected directions. The town of Bitter Springs, a rough settlement 40 miles north of the Rio Grande, became the epicenter of opposition organizing against the Copper Valley fugitives. Local ranchers and businessmen gathered in the town's only saloon on August 28th, forming a citizens' militia that would supplement the Texas Rangers' professional pursuit. These men were motivated less by law enforcement duty than by terror that successful slave revolt might inspire similar actions across Texas. Reed Palmer, who owned a modest ranch with 12 enslaved workers, emerged as the militia's informal leader. He stood before the assembled crowd with whiskey courage and genuine fear mixing in his words. If these runaways make it to Mexico, every slave in Texas will think they can murder their way to freedom. We gotta make an example so terrible that no one ever tries this again. The militia numbered 32 men, most poorly trained but heavily armed and motivated by the substantial rewards that Aaron Jennings continued increasing as days passed without captures. They departed Bitter Springs on August 29th, riding toward known water sources along likely routes to the border. Their plan was to establish ambush points where exhausted fugitives would be forced to approach, creating killing zones that would end the chase through overwhelming firepower. Meanwhile, in Mexico, a very different kind of gathering was occurring. Father Miguel Sanchez, a Catholic priest who had long advocated for escaped enslaved people, received word about the Copper Valley Revolt and began organizing resistance to Governor Santa Anna's betrayal policy. He gathered sympathetic villagers in the border town of Piedras Negras, arguing that Christian duty required providing sanctuary regardless of political considerations. Sanchez's network included former enslaved people who had successfully reached Mexico in previous years, along with Mexican citizens who viewed Texas slaveholders with contempt, dating back to the war that had separated their territories. They began preparing safe houses, gathering supplies, and establishing watch posts along the Rio Grande to identify approaching fugitives before Mexican troops could intercept them. This underground network operated in direct defiance of official policy, risking arrest and prosecution to uphold principles they considered more important than governmental orders. Sanchez sent riders north, hoping to make contact with the fugitives and warn them about the trap being prepared at official border crossings. Whether those warnings would reach Victor's group in time remained uncertain. Back with the Rangers, Captain Vaughn received intelligence from the Bitter Springs militia about their ambush positions. He coordinated his pursuit to drive the fugitives toward these killing zones, using his superior tracking skills to predict which water sources they would be forced to approach. The net was tightening from multiple directions, with professional lawmen, armed civilians, and potentially hostile Mexican forces all converging on the desperate group still struggling southward. Victor's group, now reduced to 6 people after one more had collapsed from heat exhaustion 3 days earlier, remained ignorant of these developments. They knew pursuit was close because the dogs' baying had become nearly constant, but they had no way of knowing about the militia's ambush positions or Mexico's policy change. They pushed forward with grim determination, believing that reaching the Rio Grande would deliver salvation. On the evening of August 30th, they made a discovery that briefly restored hope. Jordan Pierce, scouting ahead, found a small ranch house that appeared abandoned. Closer investigation revealed that the occupants had departed recently, leaving behind some food supplies, 2 horses in a corral, and most importantly, several canteens that could be refilled. The temptation to seize these resources was overwhelming despite the risk. Victor made the decision to approach, reasoning that horses could cut their remaining travel time in half, while fresh supplies might keep them alive long enough to reach the border. They moved toward the ranch as sunset painted the sky in shades that reminded Victor painfully of African horizons he might never see again. The building seemed to promise salvation after weeks of brutal struggle. But as they approached the corral, a rifle shot shattered the evening quiet, the bullet striking the ground inches from Victor's feet. They had walked into a trap. The abandoned ranch was actually a carefully prepared ambush position, manned by 6 militia members who had been waiting for exactly this scenario. The fugitives were caught in open ground with limited cover, facing armed men positioned in superior defensive positions. Chaos erupted as more rifles opened fire from the ranch house windows. Victor dove behind a water trough, his mind racing through options that all ended badly. They were pinned down in a killing zone with darkness still 20 minutes away, facing opponents with superior position and firepower. Running would expose them to aimed fire from multiple angles. Staying meant slow attrition as ammunition ran low. Emily crouched behind him, her breathing rapid and shallow. Jordan Pierce had made it to the corral fence using the wooden rails as inadequate cover. The other 3 members of their group were scattered across the yard, seeking whatever protection could be found in water barrels and stacked firewood. The militia's initial volley had been aimed to pin rather than kill, suggesting they wanted to take prisoners alive for the rewards. Reed Palmer's voice called from the house, "You got no chance. Throw down your weapons and you'll face trial instead of bullets." The offer was meaningless because trial meant certain execution, but it bought time for the militia to improve their positions while darkness slowly approached. Victor assessed their weapons: 2 rifles, 3 pistols, limited ammunition. Against 6 defenders in a fortified position, their odds were essentially 0 in a sustained firefight. But surrendering meant death by hanging after torture designed for public spectacle. The only viable option was breaking through the ambush during the confusion of a desperate assault, accepting that some of them would die, but possibly allowing others to escape in the gathering darkness. He caught Emily's eye, seeing in her face the same calculation. She nodded slightly, understanding what he was planning without words. Jordan received the signal through hand gestures they had developed during their flight. The attack would come in 60 seconds, giving everyone time to prepare for what would likely be their final action. But before Victor could initiate the assault, unexpected aid arrived from an impossible direction. Rifle fire erupted from beyond the ranch house, catching the militia in crossfire from a position they had not secured. Palmer's men turned in confusion, trying to identify this new threat. Victor recognized the opportunity instantly, launching the attack while their opponents were divided. His group surged forward, firing as they ran. Jordan Pierce reached the house first, smashing through a window and grappling with a militiaman in brutal close combat. Emily shot another defender who appeared in a doorway, her aim steady despite the chaos. Victor burst through the front entrance, his blade finding flesh as he fought with the desperate fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes but felt eternal. Bodies fell, blood sprayed across walls, and the sounds of violence echoed into the darkening evening. When it ended, 4 militia members lay dead or dying, while the other 2 had fled into the gathering night. But Victor's group had paid a price. 1 killed, another seriously wounded, and their ammunition nearly exhausted. The mysterious rescuers revealed themselves as the battle concluded. 5 Mexican riders led by a young vaquero named Jasper Holt, who worked for Father Sanchez's underground network. They had been searching for Victor's group to warn them about the border trap, stumbling upon the ambush by fortunate timing. Jasper explained rapidly about Santa Anna's betrayal policy and the Mexican troops waiting at official crossings. Victor felt his hope crumble even as gratitude for the rescue washed over him. They had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, only to discover that their destination offered no sanctuary. The Rio Grande was close enough to see on the horizon, yet it might as well have been on the moon if Mexican authorities would simply return them to Texas justice. But Jasper offered alternative. Father Sanchez maintained safe houses and new unofficial crossing points where sympathetic locals could provide shelter despite governmental orders. The journey would require another 3 days of hard travel, but freedom remained possible if they could evade both American pursuers and Mexican troops. Behind them, the sounds of approaching horses announced that Captain Vaughn's Rangers had heard the gunfire and were closing in rapidly. The sound of approaching Rangers gave Victor no time for deliberation. Jasper Holt gestured urgently toward his horses, speaking rapid Spanish that Jordan translated in fragments. They needed to ride immediately, abandoning the injured member of their group who could not travel at the speed required for escape. The brutal mathematics of survival demanded sacrifice again, and Victor made the decision with a numbness that came from too many similar choices over 3 weeks of flight. They mounted the horses, 3 fugitives doubling up with Mexican rescuers while Jasper led them south at a punishing gallop. Behind them, rifle shots cracked through the evening air as Vaughn's Rangers reached the ranch and discovered the carnage. The captain would know immediately that outside assistance had intervened, complicating his pursuit, but also intensifying his determination to prevent any fugitives from successfully reaching sanctuary. The ride south consumed the entire night, pushing both horses and riders beyond safe limits. They changed direction multiple times, crossing streams to confuse tracking dogs, and using rocky terrain that would leave minimal trail evidence. Jasper proved to be an expert guide, navigating by starlight through country he obviously knew intimately. By dawn, they had covered nearly 30 miles, putting crucial distance between themselves and immediate pursuit. They rested briefly in a dried riverbed while Jasper explained the situation at the border in more detail. Governor Santa Anna's orders meant that official crossing points at towns like Eagle Pass and Piedras Negras were now heavily guarded by Mexican troops under orders to detain fugitive enslaved people. However, the Rio Grande stretched for hundreds of miles, and Mexican authority was theoretical in many remote areas where sympathetic locals could provide assistance despite governmental policy. Father Sanchez had arranged for them to cross at an isolated ford 20 miles west of Piedras Negras, where the river ran shallow during late summer and where a rancher named Declan Harmon maintained a property that straddled both sides of the border. Harmon was an Irish immigrant who despised slavery on both moral and economic grounds, viewing it as competition for free labor that drove down wages for working men like himself. He had agreed to shelter fugitives and claim ignorance if authorities questioned him. The plan required reaching Harmon's ranch within 2 days, crossing during darkness, and remaining hidden for at least a week while pursuit cooled. After that, Father Sanchez would arrange transportation deeper into Mexican territory, far enough south that Texas authorities would have no practical means of recovery even if they identified the fugitives' location. Victor listened to this explanation with the wary exhaustion of someone who had learned that every plan contained fatal flaws only revealed during execution. But alternatives did not exist, so he nodded acceptance and allowed himself brief rest while Jasper's men kept watch for pursuing rangers. The next day and a half passed in a blur of constant movement through increasingly desolate terrain. They saw distant dust clouds that might have been pursuit or might have been wild horses. Impossible to determine with certainty. Water became scarce again, forcing them to ration carefully from the canteens Jasper's group carried. Emily developed a fever from an infected wound on her arm, but they had no medicine and no time to properly treat injuries that required rest and clean water. On the evening of September 2nd, they reached Harmon's ranch just as sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple. The property was modest, a small adobe structure surrounded by scrub vegetation and a few struggling crops that spoke to the harsh conditions along the border. Harmon himself emerged as they approached, a weathered man in his 50s with suspicious eyes that softened slightly when Jasper vouched for the fugitives. The Rio Grande was visible from Harmon's property, a ribbon of muddy water, perhaps 50 yards wide at this point. Mexico lay on the opposite bank, so close that Victor could have thrown a rock and watched it land in technically free territory. But crossing now would be suicide, Harmon explained, because Mexican army patrols passed through this area every few hours during daylight. They would wait for full darkness, then ford the river and hide in a cave system Harmon knew on the Mexican side. As night fell, Victor stood looking across the water that represented the boundary between slavery and freedom. He thought about the others who had begun this journey, the ones who had died or been left behind during 3 weeks of desperate flight. Mia Davis fever-dreaming in her rock shelter. The companion they had abandoned at the ranch ambush. The 18 who had perished during their imprisonment, before the revolt even occurred. So much death for this moment, standing on a riverbank with freedom 50 yards away. Emily joined him, her fever-bright eyes reflecting moonlight. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked quietly. "All the blood, all the death, just to get 6 of us across a river?" Victor considered the question seriously. 7 white men dead. At least 4 fugitives dead during the flight. Countless others who would suffer increased brutality because plantation owners now feared coordinated revolt. Against that, 6 people who would taste freedom, who would live as something other than property. The moral mathematics defied easy calculation. "Ask me again in 10 years, he finally answered. "If we build something meaningful with these lives we have stolen back, then maybe yes. If we waste them, then all those deaths meant nothing." At midnight, Harmon gave the signal. They waded into the Rio Grande, the water surprisingly cold despite the summer heat. The current pulled at their legs but was not strong enough to sweep them away. Victor felt the riverbed beneath his feet, each step carrying him closer to the opposite bank where Mexican soil promised sanctuary despite governmental betrayal. He emerged, dripping on the southern shore, turned to help Emily across and felt something fundamental shift inside him. He was free. Not legally, since Texas and the American government would never recognize his right to self-liberation. But practically, actually free in ways that transcended legal definitions. He had fought for this, killed for this, suffered beyond description for this moment of standing on foreign soil where his former owner's authority could not reach. Harmon guided them quickly to the cave system, a network of limestone formations that would shelter them from patrols. Father Sanchez would arrive within 3 days to begin the next phase of their journey deeper into Mexico. For now, they could rest, truly rest, for the first time in 3 weeks. As dawn broke over Mexican territory, Victor allowed himself to sleep without the fear that had accompanied every unconscious moment since the revolt. The sound of pursuit was silent. The chains were truly broken. The Copper Valley Revolt sent shockwaves through Texas and the broader American South that reverberated for decades. Captain Derek Vaughn continued his pursuit for another week after the fugitives crossed the Rio Grande, even entering Mexican territory illegally before being forced back by army patrols that had no interest in facilitating American slave-catching operations. He returned to San Antonio having failed his mission for the first time in his career, a humiliation that haunted him until his death in 1867. Aaron Jennings never recovered financially or psychologically from the destruction of his plantation, The insurance companies refused to pay full value for property destroyed during a slave revolt, arguing that inadequate security constituted owner negligence. He sold his remaining Texas holdings at a loss and returned to Tennessee, where he became an outspoken advocate for harsher slave codes and more aggressive pursuit policies. His testimony before state legislatures helped inspire laws that made helping fugitives a capital offense in several southern states. Of the 37 who participated in the revolt, only 11 are confirmed to have reached Mexican territory successfully. 6 crossed with Victor at Harmon's ranch, while 5 others from different groups arrived at various points along the border over the following weeks. The remaining 26 either died during the flight, were captured and executed, or simply disappeared into the vast Texas wilderness where their fates remained unknown. Victor Malone lived in Mexico for 7 years, settling in a small village south of Monterrey, where Father Sanchez's network found him work as a translator and merchant. His education and language skills allowed him to prosper modestly, though he never forgot his royal heritage or his family left behind in Africa. In 1859, as tensions over slavery pushed America towards civil war, Victor made the dangerous decision to return north, joining John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. He survived the failed uprising but was captured during the Union Army's recruitment of formerly enslaved people in 1863. He served with distinction in a colored regiment, was wounded at the Battle of Fort Wagner, and died from complications in a Philadelphia hospital in 1864, never having returned to his African homeland. Emily Johnson remained in Mexico permanently, marrying a local farmer and raising 4 children who grew up free in ways their mother never imagined possible. She lived until 1891, long enough to see slavery abolished throughout the Americas and to tell her grandchildren stories about the 3 weeks that transformed her from property into person. Her descendants still live in Nuevo León, carrying forward the legacy of courage that defined her journey. Jordan Pierce became a blacksmith in Saltillo, using his skills to support the small community of formerly enslaved Americans who had fled to Mexico. He provided tools and weapons to other fugitives passing through, maintaining the underground network that Father Sanchez had created. Mexican authorities knew of his activities but chose to ignore them, viewing assistance to American fugitives as subtle retaliation for Texas's forcible separation from Mexico. Jordan died in 1876, buried in a cemetery where his gravestone identifies him only as a free man. The Copper Valley Revolt became a cautionary tale used by slave owners to justify increased brutality and surveillance. Plantation security measures intensified across the South, with some owners building fortified quarters and maintaining armed guards on permanent patrol. The revolt also inspired fear among enslaved populations, as owners used the brutal executions of captured fugitives as public spectacles designed to crush any thoughts of resistance. Yet paradoxically, the revolt also inspired hope. Frederick Douglass eventually wrote about the Copper Valley uprising, arguing that it demonstrated the fundamental humanity of enslaved people who chose death over continued bondage. Abolitionist newspapers published accounts of Victor's royal heritage and military leadership, transforming him into a symbol of African capability that challenged racist justifications for slavery. Modern historians debate the revolt's significance. Some view it as an isolated incident with limited impact on slavery's eventual abolition, while others argue it contributed to the growing tensions that erupted into civil war. DNA analysis of descendants in Mexico has confirmed connections to specific West African ethnic groups, validating Victor's testimony about his Ashanti heritage and the illegal nature of his original capture. The most profound legacy may be simply this: 37 people who refused to accept that their humanity was negotiable, who fought with weapons and courage until some of them breathed free air on foreign soil. Their story crosses borders and generations, reminding us that freedom has always required people willing to risk everything for its promise. Victor Malone began as a prince, became a slave, led a revolt, and died a soldier fighting for principles his father would have recognized: that dignity matters more than survival, and some chains must be broken regardless of cost. The cave where they first rested in Mexican territory still exists, known locally as Cueva de los Libertadores. Visitors leave tokens, coins, and prayers for those who passed through, seeking what should never have required such desperate measures to obtain. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.